So I propose we start now. We are 53 participants so far, and we are 3 minutes over 2. Time is very precious, and so I would like to welcome you to our webinar called Let's Talk Inclusion. Are we missing the most vulnerable groups? So I'm Patrice Vastel. I'm the coordinator for the TIC project Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in MSF, and I will be one of your hosts today for the 90 minutes of this webinar. So I will start by introducing shortly myself and introducing also this webinar. And it will be also a great opportunity to bring my own testimony in this webinar, as I started to work with MSF so in 1993, and after 18 years in MSF, having worked in different missions and having worked also in the Norwegian office of MSF, I managed to leave MSF, so that means it is possible to leave MSF, and I worked, and it was for me very, very interesting, because I worked for a Norwegian organization specialized in development aid for persons with disabilities. And this is where, by working with another organization, I really discovered that maybe in MSF I didn't do really my job. I'm not sure I saw really persons with disabilities when I was working in different MSF projects. And so I had to admit that maybe I failed somewhere in my projects, because I discovered through working with another organization that I could have done, in fact, probably much better. So I learned in particular that people with disabilities face difficulties really to access health services. And I learned also that there are a lot of organizations representative of persons with disabilities who could be very valuable partners in many countries where we work. So I learned a lot on inclusion by working outside of MSF, and I thought at some stage that I should definitely bring this back inside MSF. And this is what I proposed to the MSF organization, a motion, so an international resolution to provoke a change on this point in 2016. And so I introduced a motion that was accepted by the International General Assembly to work further on inclusion of persons with disabilities in MSF. And earlier, 2018, I was recruited by the Norwegian office of MSF to coordinate this TIC project on inclusion of persons with disabilities. And we will present today some of the tools and the materials delivered by this project, and which are easily accessible on our portal, and I will of course give you the link to the portal. And all these materials are easily accessible. We will present them a bit later, and now is the time to use these materials, and this is why we are having this webinar today. So I am not alone on this project, and I am not alone to host this webinar. I have a co-host, Anna, and I will let her introduce herself. Anna, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. It's amazing to see that so many of you have decided to join us today. We are already more than 70 people in this meeting, which is amazing. My name is Anna Vliegveld, and I have been working for MSF since 2018. My background is in communications. I worked as field communications manager in Niger and DRC before joining the project last fall. And I'm responsible for communications and supporting internal advocacy of the project. So for any questions that you might have regarding ideas for communications, inclusive communications, I'm the person to reach out to, and I'm always open to having a chat about how we could do communications in a more inclusive and broader way. I will share with you my screen right now, because there are several housekeeping rules that we would like to introduce before we start this meeting. So I'm opening the slide right now. Can you see it well? So as Patrice has already mentioned, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be made available to all of you for broad dissemination also in your teams if you're interested in sharing the messages that we'll be conveying today. Please rename your account with your first and last name. Many of you have already done it, but if not, it would be great to know exactly who you are. We ask you to mute yourself when not invited to ask the question, but you're also very much invited to keep your video on so that we can see your faces and bring a bit of a non-virtual vibe to this very virtual meeting. You can use the chat function to raise any questions or provide inputs. At the end of this meeting, we'll also have a Q&A session. So this is already to signal to you that you will be able to ask questions and you can send them directly in the chat. You also have a Zoom reactions button that you can see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't hesitate to use them during the webinar to signal to us if you want to signal, for instance, that we should go slower or faster, or if you want to show your appreciation. Chat function with any participant is now enabled as well, which means that you can send a chat to everyone message, but you can also connect between each other. And you can also send a message directly to me if you have any technical questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So now I would like to share with you a 5-minute, very short video that says already quite a lot. It's really a very good tool to raise awareness and to define also some practical steps when it comes to inclusion of persons with disabilities. So it's a video that went also a bit viral at some stage. It was presented in 2018 at the International General Assembly. And it's really a video that has been very successful. It was made first available in English, then in French, and then also we have it in Arabic, thanks to the MSF United Arab Emirates. And also it was made also in Spanish, thanks to MSF Mexico. So you can very soon, you will be able to show your appreciation, in fact. And I launch, hopefully, I launched the video.
We always think having an impairment is just about disabilities. Well, it's not always true. There are some advantages. I have an hearing aid. And the nicest thing about it is that I have also an application on my telephone and I can increase the volume or, on the contrary, just close my ears. Can you do that?
My core message is that we can and we should do better when it comes to inclusion of persons with disabilities in our humanitarian response.
Don't you think we have enough to do?
For a humanitarian organization, using the argument "we have enough to do" precisely excludes the ones who need us the most. That doesn't sound very humanitarian.
Humanitarian action is about impartiality. Impartiality is about including the most vulnerable. And in places where we work, persons with disabilities are among the most vulnerable. So,
But we talk about very few people.
Well, in fact, no! About 1 billion people, 15% of the world's population, has some form of disability.
yes, and moreover, this report from Handicap International and Help Edge shows that 22% of Syrian refugees in the camps in Lebanon and Jordan have an impairment.
But where are they? We do not see them.
Precisely! Children with disabilities and people with disabilities are often most hidden in countries where we work. Victims of prejudice, stigma, taboos, and discriminations are often invisible. In MSF, we often raise the issue of the forgotten crisis. People with disabilities are one of these forgotten crises. A crisis may be also forgotten by MSF itself.
Sorry, but it's too expensive.
As we will see, many possible actions do not involve any additional costs. And when it comes to construction and accessibility, making public infrastructure accessible can cost less than 1% of the total construction costs, if accessibility is planned from the outset.
Anyway, we do not have the expertise. It will cost a lot of money, it will take a lot of time.
No worry, I take this. We can do it. I show you something. I propose you 6 simple key principles for change to become an organization more inclusive of persons with disabilities. Let's start now. The main barrier to inclusion are attitudes. Attitudes often based on wrong assumptions of what persons with disabilities can do and cannot do. Okay, it is cheaper to make facilities accessible in the construction phase than have to adapt them after. So think about it when you launch a new construction. Take reconstruction after a natural catastrophe as an opportunity to rebuild more accessible. Think about wheelchair users, promote slopes, adapted toilets, large enough doors and free passage. To reach a broader audience, think always two ways of communication, visual and audio, text and sound. Contact and collaborate with disabled people's organization. They can really be a source of inspiration regarding the needs of persons with disabilities in the region where you work. And they can give you very interesting feedback on the accessibility of your project and the design of your project when it comes to inclusion. And why not recruiting persons with disabilities among your staff? We often have a lot of prejudice about what persons with disabilities can do and cannot do. Moreover, they may help you to understand better the needs of persons with disabilities. And finally, they may have also some interesting additional skills, like knowing sign language, for instance. All that is as easy as writing people with disabilities are encouraged to apply. Finally, and most importantly, include people with disabilities in your needs assessment and in your project process and design.
I still don't agree.
Be gone.
Inclusion of persons with disabilities is easy. We can do it, let's just do it.
Right on.
Did he take my glasses?
We always
Okay, thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't hesitate to show your appreciation with using all the buttons that you have in the participants list. Don't hesitate to give us feedback. It's always very, very welcome when we are on this side. So now I wanted to show you also a small presentation, basically to tell you more about the project and what it can offer before I will leave the floor to our panel that has really a lot of contributions to bring. So I will not be too long in this little presentation. I promised to be short and I will be short. We all promised, in fact, to be short and clear. So let me show you now a little presentation about the TIC project on inclusion of persons with disabilities. So this webinar will be in three parts, basically. We have a first part where that is this one, where we are now, where the questions are, where are we on inclusion of persons with disabilities in MSF? What can we do about it? And what tools do we have? Then there will be a second part of testimonies where I will leave the floor to our panelists. And after we will have a short part about questions and eventually discussions, comments. And finally, at the end, we will also propose you to do a survey so that we will know a bit more on what are your plans ahead. So as I mentioned, all this work started on the basis of a motion that was presented at the International General Assembly of MSF, and that is the highest governing body of MSF for people who are not part of MSF. And this motion, this international resolution, was saying that MSF should develop awareness on the risk of exclusion of persons with disabilities, should contact organizations representative of persons with disabilities, disabled people organizations, and work with them, and should work on accessibility of its structures and accessibility of its communication for persons with disabilities. So that was quite a very strong message from the highest governing body of MSF. On that basis, in 2018, we started a TIC project on inclusion of persons with disabilities. So for people who don't know the TIC means transformational investment capacity. So it's an international, very precious mechanism that is important for MSF to develop transformational project. And we are very lucky to have this in MSF to promote projects that can improve the quality of our operations. So we made a proposal to the TIC in 2017, and this proposal was highly supported and approved. And we started the TIC project in 2018. And now this project is reaching its end, the end of this phase, where we try to really put the inclusion in movement. So the objective of this project was really to kick off the implementation of the motion through providing tools, resources, and also support to MSF to become more inclusive of persons with disabilities. So really a project specifically to support the implementation of the motion. So this motion, this project is really twofold, a part that is a bit more medical, operational, and aspect that is also human resources. So for the medical operational part, I think it's quite clear. The project starts with the idea, who are the patients who do not reach our services? From there, we know from experience of other actors and sometimes from our own experience that persons with disabilities are a particularly vulnerable and excluded group. And I think we will get a lot of testimonies after from our panelists about this. And so persons with disabilities are often facing barriers to access services and to access particularly healthcare services. And it is our job in MSF, I think, to identify and remove these barriers. And what we recommend, and you saw it through the video, we recommend, among others, to recruit also persons with disabilities among our staff to increase our internal sensitization. By recruiting persons with disabilities, this means, and that is the human resources part, that the overall organization should become more inclusive of persons with disabilities among our staff. So you see, it is the rationale of our project. We start with a field perspective and continue with the human resources perspective. So we started this project with a survey that was really very interesting. In April 2018, we did a small survey towards our international and national staff who was in mission in the period 2015-2017. We sent it through the associative channel to all our international and national staff in missions. And we got 239 responses, so that was 239 valid responses, so that was quite an interesting quantity. And the result is that 60% of the international staff and 80% of the national staff agreed with the statement that they should have done more when it comes to inclusion of persons with disabilities in their last assignment. So a very, very powerful statement also that came from the field. And of course, to reach this conclusion, we were explaining in the survey what it means to be inclusive of persons with disabilities. So did you have patients with disabilities? Did you have colleagues who were persons with disabilities? Did you have a communication that was inclusive? Did you do outreach activities? So we're asking all these questions and at the end saying, okay, do you think you could have done more? And everybody, all this percentage of people said, yes, definitely, we should have done more on inclusion. So very interesting also to see how much the national staff who knows better the situation in our missions on the long run and what is the situation in their civil society have been reacting even more strongly on this statement. So to provide materials, we decided also to create a portal and a newsletter to share information, to present our tool, and to also post all reference materials that could be useful. So our portal, disabilityinclusion.msf.org, is totally open. There is no password, no need of anything. By principle, we wanted it totally open and easily accessible. We had so far more than 4,300 users. And it's a portal that is available in English, French, and Arabic. And on this portal, sorry, we have different tools. So one tool, you saw it already. It is this small 5 minutes video with a small guideline, which is in English, French, Arabic, and Spanish. It's a tool to raise awareness in offices, in projects. These small videos that you saw, you can really use it to raise awareness in your office, in your project, in your association. And it is associated with this small guide on practical steps that takes again the points that were presented in the video. As you see, this is on YouTube also, so you can find the video easily on YouTube. You can download it from your website to have it, to use it in your mission. And here is basically this small guideline that also takes again the 6 keys for inclusion. And the second tool that we have that is really a beautiful one is an e-learning course. It's a 90 minutes individual course that is online also, that is easily accessible again on our portal, but that is also available on Tembo for the one who use Tembo. That is an internal MSF platform for training. It's also available on the OCA and ND Academy. We had so far at least that's the minimum really 525 users of this training, but probably much more that have used it, as we don't have all the figures from Tembo and OCA yet. So this course is really for everyone in MSF to go further on understanding inclusion of persons with disabilities and how to implement inclusion. And also, to some extent, it opens also reflection on inclusion at large. So very, very interesting also for everybody who works generally on inclusion, equity, and diversity. And among the tools that are presented by this training, for this training, I have to thank particularly FEDOMA, which is an organization of persons with disability based in Malawi, who have been really the key actor to develop this formation and this training. And this training, we did it in a project that I have to thank also. It's the project MSF OCB, the Mbare project in Zimbabwe, where we did 2 days live training with FEDOMA, and this training led us to develop this online training. And we would like also to thank a lot really MSF Canada, who did the online version of this training, totally pro bono, and really with a huge expertise and talent to develop a beautiful product. So it's a really a beautiful baby, and I invite really everybody to take 90 minutes to do it. You will never regret it. And inside this training, so there is what we call as a tool the barrier analysis that is presented. And I think barrier analysis is an extraordinarily powerful tool. If you talk about inclusion in human resources or inclusion for our patients, or generally inclusion of whoever is usually victim of discrimination, it's always important to think about the barriers that people are facing. And when you talk about these barriers, it's very good to think them in 4 different ways, to say what are the attitudes that hamper the access of this person to services or to the organization, what are the physical aspects that hamper the access, what are the communication aspects, and what are the institutional aspects. So to give some examples, I think it's quite self-explanatory, but attitude is about, for instance, the attitude of our staff in the hospital. Do we welcome persons with disabilities? Our attitude of the community itself towards persons with disabilities that may hamper their access to services. Physical is a lot about, for instance, do we have offices and do we have health structures which are accessible to persons with disabilities? Communication, so of course, it's you do a HIV/AIDS campaign. Do you think about using 2 ways of communication, posters, so something visual, and for instance, using the radio also as something that is a bit more audio? And institutional, for instance, when it comes to recruitment of persons with disabilities, are we really open to recruit persons with disabilities? Do we include this in our policies? Do we think about mentioning when we have a job offer that we promote inclusion and diversity, and that persons with disabilities are also welcome to apply? So this barrier analysis is really a very powerful tool that you will learn through this e-learning, and that can be used not only for persons with disabilities, but also for many other groups. So to finish this presentation, what can be the next step for MSF and for the people attending this webinar? It's really do the e-learning course, use the videos that we shared at the beginning in the association, like in the executive, to raise awareness, to promote the e-learning. So you can show the video and after say, okay, now do the e-learning course, et puis kick off the discussion. So once people have seen this video for raising awareness, once they have done the e-learning, but really start to discuss and see what can we do about it in our project, in our association, in our office. So that is the way we see things could really work. So thanks a lot for your patience on this. You will find here, you have the name of the portal, disabilityinclusion.msf.org. You have the link also on the same portal to the e-learning. And also, we recently also made a special page about the COVID that has also a set of tools particularly adapted to the situation in relation to the COVID. And you have also our email address. Do not hesitate to contact us if anything. So thanks a lot for listening to that presentation. And now I will go to our panel. So we are now starting the second part of our webinar with testimonies on inclusion, to be sure we understand well the situation we are facing when it comes to inclusion and what we can do about it. So let me introduce our first panelist, who is Habiba Ali Amin. So Habiba is, so I will introduce shortly Habiba. Habiba is a member of the International Board of MSF. Habiba is a clinician and a mental health practitioner with a degree in psychology from the University of Nairobi. She first started working with refugees in Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya in 2006. Since then, Habiba has held a number of roles in MSF, including Deputy Medical Coordinator, Field Coordinator, Emergency Field Coordinator, and Medical Referent. When not working with MSF, Habiba does psychotherapy among urban refugees and research on mental health among the Somali community. Finally, Habiba knows also very well the Kenyan Sign Language that she practices in her work. So thanks a lot, Habiba, for being here. The floor is yours, as well as the next 10 minutes that are all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrice, for that. I'll try to wrap in the next 10 minutes. Kindly slow me down. I've been accused of being so fast. So I'm trying to say a lot of things in 10 minutes. So basically, first of all, I want to apologize or give a disclaimer. I'll be saying a lot of things, so I'll look like I copied what Patrice just said. So I didn't copy, it was not my intention. Okay, so before I start, I want to explain, or I want to ask to think what the people we're talking about, who are we talking about? I come from a family where we have people with special needs. I have an elder sister who's deaf and dumb. Amazing. So we've been signing all our lives. If you want to gossip, we go into the signing mode. I have a brother who's partially deaf, and they're doing amazing in life. But I could relate with them, you know, during childhood and everything else. So what does it mean when we talk about people with disability in a humanitarian crisis? This is a population that is already vulnerable in the first place. This is a population that is stigmatized all their life. You know, in COVID, we were feeling stigmatized, and I was telling people, this is how these people have been feeling all their lives. So welcome to the club. These are people who've been living in the shadow of other people for all their lives. They've been discriminated. They've been least on the priority. If people have to move and they have to run away from crisis, you know, it's more of a burden picking them up than actually considering picking them up. We also need to also consider that they've been so prone to abuses, both physical and sexual, since their childhood. So whether we're talking about defilement, molestation, and in the end, they have physical issues, but also mental health issues. But unfortunately, the gap that exists between them having these issues and seeking available care is so huge. So I'm going to give my personal opinion of why I think as an organization, we do amazing work, but most of the time we forget that the forest is made of individual trees. One of the things is our emergency mode, how we function. You know, the end justifies the means. We want to be there, we want to save lives. It doesn't matter who we are saving lives. We lack the aspect of awareness. And it's not our fault. It's just that it's not been created in us. It's not been interpreted in us. We've not been made to realize that if we need to prepare the non-food items, we need to put some hearing aid, for example, for somebody who's displaced and ran and left the hearing aid behind. or a walking stick for somebody who needs it to use it to do movements. Something else that we also need to realize is that the aspect of data. Until last year, when we were talking about patient charter, or the person-centered approach in terms of patient management, we've all been seeing people as, we need to see people as people. And one of the things you will realize, and I will give a personal experience. In 2014, I was a deputy field coordinator, and we were doing the every OC has its name, annual review of operation, action plan, plan of action, whichever the name. And I included in the budget, we want to, have a line for training people on sign language, and everybody thought I was speaking gibberish, and it was declined at that point in time. I didn't stay long in the project. After a while, I left. But what I'm trying to say is that we see people, we look at people, but we don't actually see them. We don't understand the language they want to speak. We understand confidentiality is messed up in normal people, but we don't look at it from the angle of, I am HIV positive, or I've just been raped and I'm coming into a consultation room and I have to speak and somebody has to translate what I'm saying. So these are things that we have to struggle with. I'm super excited to hear this discussion coming. It's 6 years later, no worries, we are moving, but we need to see at what post we need to move. Something else, we also need to understand that we all have our unconscious biases. And this is where we have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable aspect. We see people and we think we judge them. We all have our own aspect of what we've been taught. Some people are seen as taboos in their culture. Some people are bad omen. They've been cursed. That's why they are disabled, for example. Do we come with this kind of, misconceptions in how we deal with them? So our own unconscious biases, and this is where training can never do, but empathy will. When you leave your shoe and you put yourself in somebody else's shoe. Something else we also need to see is and realize is that we have to understand that we keep singing impartiality. This is the aspect of making it a reality and give it its due right. So one of the things that I think we should do, and it's been mentioned by Patrice, are we need to challenge our own attitudes. We need to challenge our own unconscious biases. We need to be open. Human resource, I've never seen anywhere where they're written, like you said, during a vacancy, special needs more encouraged. If you speak sign language, it's an asset. We always put other languages, experience in NGO, blah, blah, blah. We should also try to see how disability comes in as an asset. I'm looking forward to a day where we do orientation, induction, briefing, and the words that come out, just like we talk about emergency medical humanitarian, we also tell people that we are pro people with disability. We love working with people with disability. You will find we have, ramp instead of stairs for people who are using wheelchairs and crutches, for example. Our doors are big enough to allow wheelchairs to come in. The few projects I've seen, to be very honest, are projects that have been built because of validation by the government that require people to adhere to this kind of policies, where you have toilets. But when you look at our logistics, and for the few logisticians in the house, my apologies for speaking on their behalf, but one thing we have to realize is when they're building, Watson is not friendly at all for people with disability. The latrines that people construct, for example, the water and sanitation, latrines that are constructed, for example, in emergency crisis, I'm yet to see one that has been said that this one is for people with disabilities. So when we run around, we do an amazing job, but we forget these wonderful people. Empathy and kindness, I keep repeating it. We should be comfortable with uncomfortable. We should be able to understand our own barriers, communication-wise. What is the body language that we give other people when somebody comes to you and tells you, I don't speak? What is your reaction? Do you take a paper and a pen and introduce yourself? Or do you go and say, sorry, we don't have any service for you? Why do I think, what are the recent developments that I think are opportunities that we can grab as an organization? I don't want to talk about EDI. We've talked about EDI a lot of times. I just want to pick the concept of COVID-19. For the first time in history, COVID-19 brought everybody at the same level. We were all vulnerable at the same time. Whether you had money or you didn't have money, you were still vulnerable. People faced stigma. People faced lockdowns. People realized what isolation was supposed to mean. This is the life these people have lived all their life. So for once, we need to put on their shoe and realize, oh, I didn't know this is how they were feeling all along. We have the regional associations that are amazing. These are the center of operations. This is where actions happen. We have amazing people. So if you want to look executive and associative, these are the platforms I believe that we have up and out there that we can use. And then the patient charter that came about at the IGA last year, I think is an opportunity to look at a patient from mental health, we say biopsychosocial aspect. You look at the person from a physical aspect, from a psychosocial aspect, and from a community perspective. Try to remove your shoe and ask somebody who doesn't speak, who has hearing difficulty, how does it feel? Do you have a counselor within your team? You're running SGBV vertical project, for example, but you don't have any counselor that can tackle anybody. For me, in my opinion, it's unacceptable. And this is things that we need to forward for. We have the MSF We Want to Be process coming up, and I want to see a discussion on people with disability coming on board. How do we make our PPDs and SANU? You come into MSF and you told as a logistician, when you're building a door, this is a standard door because a wheelchair has to go through. When you're talking about human resource, this is what human resource you need to do. I remember in one of the emergencies we were tackling a couple of years back, we had a clinician and he got sick and he ended up using crutches, but you could see the discomfort everybody had around him. And unfortunately, after a couple of months, he was late to go because we couldn't find anything for him. And people felt like he was filling a job, but he was not able to do. I was bad about it. I still feel bad about that decision that we made. But these are things that we need to move away from. If truly we want to say inclusion and diversity, there is no inclusion with people with disabilities. And unfortunately, you will see discussions for the last, I think, since 2017, we've been talking about inclusion and diversity in MSF. And most of the time, especially in the field associative debates and general assemblies, most of the time it ends up in national staff versus experts or international staff. I hate these words normally, but I'm going to use them today. Or you also have it moving into gender, but very few people will say we can't cope with people with disabilities the way we are moving. So we are 49 years, turning 50 next year. I think we need to be open-minded. We cannot have inclusion without inclusion of people with disabilities. So let's be, uncomfortable. Try to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Let's stop this aspect of saying the end justify the means. It's the means justifying the end here. And we need to see how we move. For us, we need to move forward. We need to see how best, and we need to set examples. So if we are talking, we are talking the talk, let's also walk the walk. I'll stop here. I hope I was not too fast. And I guess I saved a few minutes so the next person can enjoy the minutes. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Abiba. It was wonderful. It was really very, very powerful presentation, and really thanks a lot for respecting your time slot. Challenge our attitudes and no inclusion without inclusion of person with disabilities. So you had a number of very, very strong statements. For our external guests, and because we have some external people both in our panel and also among our participants. So the PPD and the SANU are our induction program for new staff coming inside MSF. In the field, in that case. Voilà, thanks a lot. So now I would like to introduce our next panelists. So I have a beautiful panel with an amazing amount of expertise. So I have Sonia Meiros, Jessie Verschure, and Lucy O'Connell. So I will introduce all three of them, and after I will leave them the floor. So Sonia is the OCBA advisor for humanitarian anthropology, community engagement, and health promotion. Sonia is also assistant professor in the fields of poverty and social exclusion, adult education and training, and special needs inclusion at the University of Coimbra. Sonia is experience coordinator at international projects in the topic of radicalization, migrants, refugees, and inclusion. She has a PhD in adult education and training, a master's in education science, and much, much more than that. Jessie is the OCB technical advisor for health promotion, community engagement, and anthropology. Jessie has a background as anthropologist and has been working for MSF for now 10 years, mainly in MSF missions as health promoter, anthropologist, and also in other positions. And Lucy is a key populations advisor with the South African Medical Unit. She has over 20 years of experience working with communities and adapting models of care for hard-to-reach populations in HIV, sexual and reproductive health in the UK and also abroad with MSF and other NGOs. Lucy is a sexual and reproductive health nurse with a Women's Health Bachelor of Science from the University of London and a Master's in Public Health. So Sonia, Jessie, Lucy, the floor and the next 15 minutes are all yours.
First and foremost, I would like to say a big thank you to the previous people that talked. I think that you said the key messages that we are willing to share, and I think that there is a lot here that we can bring home, namely how we can improve our own attitudes and our own lenses when we are talking about integration, inclusion, and seeing diversity in a positive way. While they are putting the slides, I would like to stress that sometimes the issue starts with the lenses that we use when we are thinking and acting with people and the communities, namely because usually we have our own checklists, tools, and other documents and sources that we use to better understand people and the communities. But most of the times, those elements, those tools are made and are created by our own ways of seeing things. We can never see the complexity of the reality in the way that the reality actually is. So we need to broaden our own lenses. And one approach that we could use to broaden these lenses is actually to consider diversity and to consider inclusion when we are thinking from all the stages in the project cycle, including assessments, including actions, including designing our structures, including the way that we do community engagement and health promotion. I think that we consider in theory that we have many lenses like gender, age, ethnicity, race, status, but many times we consider them in theory, but then when we actually think of how to act, we reduce the lenses that we use to see reality to the lenses that we are most used to. So for me, one of the first things we need to walk the walk is on how to see complexity from different people and communities' perspectives. And this includes doing engagement with different groups, with a diversity of people with disabilities, considering also the complexity and the big scope that complexity has. I would like to present very briefly in 2 minutes, 3 examples from the field. The first example was in an intervention. In Maiduguri, we had a project that was focused on nutrition. And one day I was called by the PMR because they had a child and a mother, and both were crying all the time, and they didn't know what to do. And for me, it was super interesting because the child had cerebral palsy, and the mother didn't know, and she didn't know what this was, and she didn't know what to do with the child, and the child was in pain. And it was interesting because as HPs, we were asked to find possibilities and solutions. And sometimes it's about what can I bring, and what can I bring is something that I build with the mothers, with the communities. So what we brought was the possibility of together with the other mothers and the other children to do massage, and to do a massage that was adapted to help the child with cerebral palsy to have less pain. I brought this example because I think that mini steps, small actions are also relevant. Obviously, they will not solve the complexity of the discussion that we are bringing, but we can do the difference in many actions that we have every day. We can challenge ourselves on how to be more inclusive, on how to walk with the other shoes, how to be empathetic, how to be kind every time that we are with others. So I think that this challenge also is something that we can embrace in our daily lives. The second example is when I went to India to visit a project on HIV. And I particularly asked about transgender, if we had any patient or any family member. And they told me that they didn't have patients because there was no transgender people with late stages of HIV in that context. And I brought this example because sometimes we think that if people are not in our facilities, if they didn't reach out, this is because they don't exist or because they are very few, which is not the case. This is about being able to open again our lenses and to be open to the things that we might not be open previously. Obviously, there are transgender, and obviously there are people that struggled with late stages of HIV. The issue was discrimination and exclusion, and those people, they were not feeling at ease to choose the hospital to ask for support. So a different engagement and a tailored engagement needed to be thought out, so we can actually reach out to those people, considering what are their specific needs and how we can approach them in a good way. And the last example is war-wounded soldiers. We were dealing with war-wounded soldiers by supporting physically, providing mental health. But one of the things that the families was asking me was, how can I help my husband? Because now he cannot walk anymore, and he probably will not be active anymore in the conflict. So how can we support, and what can we do? And at some point, I also think that we are focused on the idea of saving lives as a matter of physically and psychologically, but we don't integrate the idea of diversity and inclusion, considering that they are part of systems, they are part of families, they are part of communities, and those families and communities might also need support in better adjusting their knowledge, their attitudes, and their practices to the challenges of an acquired disability, for instance. So I think that those three examples are super different from each other, but they are illustrations of how can we challenge ourselves to provide a more comprehensive and holistic care by opening up to the seeing the reality with different lenses that are not necessarily our own, but are especially the lenses of those that we should be working with and not only working for. Thank you. Jesse?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I will give another example from the lenses from gender, age, and power, which will also show how inclusion or not having inclusion can have a major impact on general operations, even to the level that it can stop operations or that it can really facilitate operations. So my example is from the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014-15, and more specifically in Guinea and Liberia on the border area. There, the traditional approach by many other actors, also in the beginning MSF, you have to say, was really engaging with local leaders, the formal leaders, mostly men, and from there, focusing there also in the information provision, everything was focused towards them, and wrongly assuming that the information would trickle down automatically from the leaders to the rest of the population. Wrongly assuming also that that they are in control of the population. So if you have their trust, you have the trust of the whole population. But very fast, the reality showed a different situation. So that resistance came up, and not necessarily from these leaders, but from the grassroots level, from different groups that were not represented or that were not so visible in the traditional decision making, let's say. So what we also saw that actually these leaders were also criticized by many population groups. They were also part of rumors, seeing them as profiteers and so on. So they were not having that authority as they had before. We saw also that the information didn't trickle down, that many groups, even months after the start of health promotion activities and so on, that they didn't have this information, the basic information about Ebola and so on. And then most importantly, we saw also that there is strong resistance from the less visible groups and the ones that are not traditional part of the decision making, such as adolescents and young mothers, and in particularly. And they resisted in their own way. For example, they would hide symptoms of children, they would hide their own symptoms, they would refuse to come to the CTC, they would refuse to talk with the outbreak response teams. There was a general lack of trust with them. And that was not so seeing strange because there has not been engagement with them at all until we changed the approach, let's say. Also was not taken into account that young mothers were seen as the traditional caregivers. So actually by asking them to let their child in isolation, not even anymore in their hands, is doing distance from that role as a traditional caregiver, it had a big impact on them as well to accept. So what we did, what health promotion teams and what also more general did, we developed a strategy that was really focusing on these less visible groups as priority groups to engage with, to have adapted approaches, adapted materials, and for sure, first of all, listen to them. How can we help them? How can we help include them better? Secondly, also in our health promotion teams, we had them included. We had young mothers included who knew very well how to talk and knew very well how to approach certain subjects. We also had engagement with adolescents by schools or by adolescent groups. Just as an example, how easily you could do this, just to have it mapped out, to look from that lens, and to have them represented in your outbreak response. Another quick example I want to give is in totally other context. It's in Athens, it's the Victims of Torture program. And it shows that that advocacy can be done also from a very bottom-up way. Often advocacy in MSF is done by collecting testimonies, and then MSF decides on what they want to frame the story on. But in Athens, in the project for survivors of torture from migrants, they created support groups of survivors of torture, where they decided on what they want to speak out on. So these groups, they decided, okay, we want to speak out on this, but not on this. So the power was given back to them to frame their own stories, which also had also beneficial aspects for even therapeutic aspects for them, because they regained control over their own stories and they were speakers about their own health issue. So very quickly, these were two examples I wanted to share how inclusion can really have a broader operational impact. I give the word to Lucy.
Thank you, Jesse and Sonia and everyone. Thank you for all the previous speakers. I think we're all quite well interconnected with the topic that I'm going to describe now. So what I'm going to talk about is about key populations. Key populations are a group of people that are by far the greatest risk, have the greatest risk to HIV in the world, regardless of the context and epidemic type. According to the UNAIDS, key populations carry 62% of new HIV infections in the world, occurring in their own populations and communities. This term, actually, we often use it in HIV programming. So we work with key populations normally when we're doing these projects. And it refers to populations who, in addition to having high risk of HIV, they're also discriminated against the law. And this further increases their vulnerability and exacerbates problems of accessing much needed care. So well, I was thinking about this talk today, and I was thinking, well, we have been working to fight against HIV for many, many years in the region, but somehow, we seem to have systematically forgotten these most vulnerable and excluded populations. And as you look at the picture, you might wonder why. So I will focus on talking about our experiences of working with mainly sex workers, men who have sex with men, and transgender people. But we also have a few projects addressing the needs of people who use drugs and prisoners, but I'm not going to talk about them today. But the characteristics of these communities are quite similar, and one of the most complicated ones is that they can be quite difficult to engage with. We often have, trust issues. So this is what exclusion looks like. There is active exclusion. Yeah, it's a deliberate, systematic policy led by government to actively exclude and criminalize people who challenge our concepts of sexuality and gender normativity. Myths and misconceptions, mistrust, disgust, morality, attitudes is what makes us find it really difficult to connect with members of these populations. Sometimes we can't even identify their risks because we don't really ask when we see people in our clinics. We can't bring ourselves to talk about sex sometimes, yeah? So beliefs like they're doing this to themselves or they are the cause of HIV in my country are at the root of the problem. And this rejection makes people even more vulnerable to their risks. So sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender people experience deep stigmatization, discrimination, and utter social exclusion, which translates into violence and being denied access to healthcare. So what have we done with MSF? How did we get to where we are now? So this is what inclusion looks for us. Change, please, change the slide. Because this is a happy team, yeah? And this is what happened when we suddenly started engaging with sex workers and MSM as well. So a group of sex workers came from across the border from a project we were working in Mozambique, knocked at our door, our office door, saying that they had seen our cars, MSF, working with HIV, and that they hadn't had any access to ART because they were sex workers, but also foreigners. And this really sparked a real kind of sudden jump. I mean, the MSF team there in this project in Mozambique had been well aware that there were many, many sex workers and other vulnerable populations in this coal mining town for years, but it had never occurred to anyone to go into this, to look into this, because other people would do it. There's other people who can do that. Yeah, we refer people. We don't deal with that. So actually, it took a warm-hearted bunch of key leaders within the mission and in the cell to, embark us in this journey. Actually, initially, I think it took a really kind of strong-hearted and warm-hearted bunch of sex workers to be brave enough to say, hello, we need your services. So we soon identified talented and interested peers who would take us into this story of success and transformation, because they became our staff. Yeah, but the road was not easy. It was really difficult. There was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance to change. Our HIV service delivery is not supposed to be that way. We've got these models like so, quite top down. It's all about the doctors and nurses and counselors who know best what to do, never talking about sex, of course, or diverse sexualities. So it's taken us a long time to get to where we are today. But basically, inclusion was enabled by so many adaptations we had to make to our kind of set design of HIV programming. One major one was, of course, including SRH from the start, because you can't answer to the needs of sex workers in particular, nor MSM, if you're not talking about sexual health and behavior and risk. So inclusion was enabled by many, many adaptations, but maybe the major one was regular and alternative ways to train and sensitize staff. We found that this worked through value and attitude clarification style workshops, sometimes using videos and storytelling, but most of all, actually, what made the major changes was members of staff accompanying sex worker peers to their sites, seeing and feeling for themselves what it was really about, life as a sex worker, or life as a man who has sex with men, or life as a transgender person. And it actually was a bit like walking in the shoes of others whilst in projects. We also actually use these same techniques to train partners, other people who we always have to think, of project exit time, so plan in advance to hand over. So, you know, inviting Ministry of Health, healthcare workers, or inviting other stakeholders to do the same as we did was very important. So like that, we started creating friendlier environments. So we recruited peers who are true experts by experience. You know, you've heard of this term before. You know, we recognize their talent and motivation to join us as staff rather than their academic achievements. And we mentored those that had the initiative to engage with their communities. So we allowed these peers to lead us, to tell us where the problems were in the community, and they actually in time became the counsellors and the community health workers who are today able to deliver task-shifted services such as HIV testing, emergency contraception. They can deliver post-exposure prophylaxis in the community, and even some of them can provide medical abortion, yeah, within safety. So we have realized that the best people to provide services for hard to engage with excluded populations are those who are part of those communities themselves. So another good lesson was obviously providing one-stop services, you know, all at the same time, same day, same site, and ideally the same person providing, the same who. Because that's what works best, I think, for all of us. You know, you don't necessarily go to anyone. You want to feel, accepted, liked. So basically, having the same types of people responding to needs was a very important part. And we did integrate we had integrated patient-centered. We have packages of care, which is SRH, HIV, TB, and a whole package of extra healthcare possibilities. Each other venue that a person has to access represents another barrier for people to access, like spending more money or traveling far. So this is why the one-stop approach was a winner. We have also learned that we need to have a mix of Ministry of Health and NGO health facility-based, integrated and parallel tailored. We have to have a diverse way of delivering services. Older sex workers do not access the same time or the same venue as younger sex workers. We don't say adolescent sex workers, we say adolescents who engage in, you know, transactional sex or cell sex. You know, one has to design different ways of delivering services because they themselves also find difficulties of inclusion, I would say. So services for men who have sex with men, also, they tend to have another type of design. Male sex workers and transgender sex workers can have a common ground. Yeah, tend to be all right.
Lucy, sorry to interrupt, but you are much over time. Can you wrap up in 1 minute maximum?
Yes. So what I was going to say, one of the biggest success stories comes from the collaboration with partner organizations who are expert key population representatives themselves, who we invited to have us trained. And this is what has totally sort of changed the way that we are now seeing how we use inclusion of key population leadership in programming in MSF. Because actually out of this, what we see is that sex workers themselves have made now their own grassroots organizations, which we're looking into supporting to see their future when we exit programs. You know, and as Jessie was saying, advocacy and communication has to come up, bottom up, so that we do get this programming moving. And this is something that we've been seeing with these types of programs. Maybe change slide. You know, we have been following the slogan of nothing about us without us, and we're proud of that. We have adopted also this umbrella sign, which means in the international community of key population programming, represents inclusion and protection against violence. And just before I go, I just wanted to relay a couple of messages from my colleagues in the field. One of them is a peer sex worker who said that in the beginning, MSF wasn't open. You know, they said, sex workers are full of nonsense. They don't know anything. And it was very difficult to start with. But then since MSF has done all these trainings and capacity building, MSF has changed. And now their employees have positive minds to this community. MSF has achieved to reduce stigma and discrimination, not only within MSF, but also with the Ministry of Health. And then a counsellor said, well, you know, in the beginning, I didn't trust any of the sex workers because they were, you know, they brought me trouble. But then I had to understand, and I followed their roles, and I learned a lot. And it hasn't been an easy job, but now we know that we have achieved our goal of including populations as staff in our projects. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Lucy, Jessie, and Sonia. So now I know what is worth Lucy's 1 minute. I know it can be pretty interesting ones. It was really very, very interesting content. So now I would like to move to our next speaker, Marc Biot, who is Director of Operations for the Operational Center of Brussels, one of our 6 operational centers. And Marc regrets to not be able to be here live, but I reassure you, he recorded his contribution within a short 5 minutes video that is really an amazing one. So big thanks to Marc for doing that, and also a big thanks to the communication department of the OCB, who has been really working last minute on that. So I let you watch now this video that is really very, very interesting. And to remind you that Marc Biot is the operational director for one of our major operational centers in MSF. Marc, the floor is yours.
Dear friends, when Patrice and Anna approached me to have a little word on the topic of today's webinar, including the inclusion of people with disabilities, I felt very honored, enthusiastic, and by the same time I was wondering, what did I do myself to include further and better people with disabilities in the projects I have run in MSF? Patrice and his teams inform us about the different barriers that exist in our operations, in our attitude, in the environment we build, how we organize, in the space, in the communication that we have with people, or simply in our institutional thinking, in how we work, in how we handle. And they inform us that with very little means, with very acceptable means, we can make a big difference. MSF is by nature, by essence, medical and humanitarian. Yet, we fall too much in the trap of looking to patients without looking at the human behind the patients. We look and we work with colleagues, but who are our colleagues, in fact? We forget too often that some of our colleagues, some of our patients, may face invisible barriers to access the services or the jobs we offer. Yet, in our operational prospects 2020-2023, we affirm a strategic orientation, several priorities that should guide us in thinking naturally about including people with disabilities. We state in that document that we will focus on vulnerability and neglect. We want to keep the patient at the center of our attention, develop a bottom-up approach. We want to develop a continuum of care between communities, health centers, hospitals. We want to get the right staff at the right place and the right role. We want to act responsible and accountable. These are all dimensions, indeed, where we have an opportunity to reflect about today's webinar. And our medical strategies, 2020-2023, we want to deliver high impact medical interventions to meet the health needs of the populations, to meet the demands of the populations we intend to serve. We focus on the most vulnerables. We focus on the biggest needs and impact. We want to provide quality treatment to prevent the creation of disabilities. And even in one of the documents also it's mentioned that we want to develop activities where childcare with disabilities can be tackled. When looking at the video myself and reading through some documents that were produced by Patrice and his team, it remembers me as well of the earlier days when more than 20 years ago we started putting people with HIV on antiretroviral treatments. At that time, stigma, shame, ignorance was preventing patients to come to the health services and was preventing our health staff to provide the life-saving treatments. And now, 20 years later, we've engaged in community development, community programs. We've developed community dynamics where people participate, are included, and are themselves agents of change for bringing the treatment in their communities. What has helped us to get out of the obstacle was to step out of our professional way of thinking from an ivory tower, to sit down and think together with the patients, to think about their reality and changing our offer to their reality rather than their reality to our offer. Of course, we have many competing priorities. There are so many requests, yet Patrice and his team want to make us attentive that there are simple steps that we can do that will just make this difference, like we did 20 years ago when we started providing treatment to patients with HIV that were stigmatized, neglected, forgotten, and that we thought it was impossible to do something. And agreed, the difference that will be requested might not appear in our guidelines. It's not an operational procedure, it's not an SOP. It doesn't appear in our job descriptions. It just asks us to have an open heart and to look around, to sit down with partners, to think comprehensively about access and offer. And these are not by coincidence the conditions not only to address the topics of today's webinar, but also to make just the difference in our daily life, in our medical, humanitarian work of every day. I wish you plenty of success and endeavors, plenty of good ideas, and enjoy the webinar. Thank you very much.
So thanks a lot for that, Mark. And now I will introduce our last speaker, Miroslava Tatarin. Miroslava is our external guest. Miroslava is working for Wellspring Philanthropic Fund as the Disability Rights Program Officer. Miroslava has worked over the past 15 years to ensure access to health services and humanitarian assistance for people with disabilities worldwide. Passionate about disability rights, she worked for Humanity and Inclusion, formerly known as Handicap International, in Ethiopia, Senegal, Jordan, and Canada to improve access to healthcare in humanitarian settings. Miroslava has a master in public health in developing countries from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So Miroslava, the floor and the next 10 minutes are yours. You are very welcome.
Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion coming afterwards as well. And I think that all of the previous panels have been impressive in their coverage of both issues and recommendations. So I'll actually try to condense to less than 10 minutes so that we're sure to have time for questions. As I just mentioned, the speakers that came before me, it's impressive to see the extent of understanding and analysis, I think, from MSF, whose work I've admired overall throughout my life, but hasn't necessarily been at the forefront of disability inclusion, but to see that movement coming from within MSF is very exciting and encouraging. So I want to use the time that's remaining to highlight what disability inclusion can offer. I think that already the vulnerabilities and the exclusion and the needs have been covered. And I want to focus on 2 points. First of all, that facilitating access to health services for people with disabilities actually helps a much broader population than only those people that we perceive or that identify as disabled. And secondly, that having an inclusive perspective brings a lot of strengths and diversity to our workforce, but also to the networks that MSF can build in the communities in which it works. So in terms of facilitating access to health services, oh my goodness, was I muted the whole time?
No, it was okay. We just lost
okay, good.
1 little second.
Okay, good. So in terms of in ensuring inclusive access to services, I think that too often we see people with disabilities as a limited population. But in fact, if we ensure that our communications are accessible, that our physical spaces are accessible to as broad a population as possible, then in fact, service will be facilitated for many more people. So for example, elderly persons. Generally, most elderly persons do not identify as disabled, and yet they experience many of the same barriers in terms of physical barriers or communication barriers due to like hearing impairments and other sensory impairments that are a result of age. So already we're broadening the scope of who can access services more easily by making sure that that our services are accessible to people with disabilities. And then there's other people as well, perhaps single parents who are trying to move around with many children, or people who women who are pregnant in their final trimester. They may have difficulties walking, and that's not because they have a disability, but yet having spaces that are easier to navigate will immediately make that environment more comfortable for them as well. So we see that our circle is growing broader. More.
We lost you. We are losing you, Miroslava.
That's very strange. I'm sorry. I don't know why it's defaulting to mute.
So it was just 2 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of building strength and diversity in the workforce, I think it's time for the humanitarian sector to also see people with disabilities as possibilities and assets to the workforce, and not just as beneficiaries. And this is really a point not only for MSF. I'm afraid to say that that is a predominant kind of unspoken or unconscious bias in many organizations, even those whose mission is to provide services for people with disabilities. So for example, I was working as a researcher based at an orthopedic hospital in Malawi, run by a smaller NGO focused on pediatric physical impairment. And the wards were very accessible, but yet all of the offices were upstairs. And yes, I have a physical disability, but I can manage a flight of stairs, so I was fine. But it just shows that there's that underlying assumption that nobody in a professional position would need to have an accessible space. It was only the patients. And again, in many of the places where we work, it is difficult to have to find accessible spaces because of the infrastructure. So I'm not calling out the specific situations. It's always a challenge to find acceptable places to work, especially in emergency contexts. But just to be aware of what unconscious biases exist when we're setting up our workplaces. And I've also found that and that the workplace needs to change and become more diverse at all levels. So yes, in terms of national staff, in terms of international staff. My own presence as a white person with a visible disability has disrupted the biases or the expectations that people have had about us and them. And it's actually been shocking sometimes to see people in different countries surprised to see a white disabled person arrive, because that's never been the case before, and that it's kind of challenged perceptions of the have and have not. And I think that that's really important. And as we've seen with the sex worker example, as we know from experience of having more women as health workers, having people see themselves in their service providers can actually also help increase access as people feel more comfortable seeking out care and services in others that they can kind of see themselves in. And then I think finally, a point that Patrice made in the beginning is that disabled people's organizations can be valuable partners, but those are not always formal organizations. So just as an example, when I was doing a needs assessment at the South Sudanese border on the Ethiopian side, I was working for HI at the time. When we arrived and asked the camp leaders to see if we could speak with some newly arrived refugees with disabilities, this was in the first months of the camp, so new people were arriving every day. They said, well, these people have walked for 10 days, there won't be any disabled people, they wouldn't have made it. And yet they're at the intake registration center, there happened to be a young person with a physical disability who had worked as a teacher in South Sudan, so he was working as a translator. And within hours, he found more than a dozen individuals with disabilities and also parents of children with disabilities that had carried some of their children for those 10 days and made it across the border. And we were quickly able to speak with them about their experience and just show that they were there. And that's because they speak to each other. And because there was that one person who had a disability themselves at the intake center, we were quickly able to find those networks. And I think that it's really important to recognize that those networks exist, but also that they are diverse. So also from the Ebola example that Jesse had presented, that there's a danger in relying on one sole source of information. And that's the same even within disabled people, that groups of people with disabilities are not uniform. And those same patterns of patriarchy, of exclusion based on gender, based on linguistic groups and others can be reinforced and are reinforced within groups of people with disabilities, because disability does not then preempt all other forms of social organization. And so it's important to seek out those diversities of opinions within when seeking out the opinions of people with disabilities as well. And that sometimes these solutions that people come up with will not be what we automatically assume. And so I will wrap up there. There's so much more I could say, but I know that the webinar will be wrapping up soon, and I do want to make sure that there's at least a few minutes remaining for discussion. Thank you so much. And I hope that we will have other opportunities to exchange in future. Thank you.
And I'm sure of that, Miroslava. It was excellent. Thanks a lot for that. And I saw a lot of applause really in the group and a lot of thumbs up. So thanks a lot for having brought your contribution here. It's very appreciated. So now we will have you will have a choice to make, and we will have to improvise a little bit because we are quite late in our schedule. So as it's 3:26, so we will have two categories of people, people attending this webinar. The first category are the people who want really to finish at 3:30. So for these ones, we will put now in the chat the link to a small survey. As it's an action-oriented webinar, we would really love you to take 3 minutes to fill up the survey and to tell us what you got from this webinar and what you are going to do next on inclusion. So Anna is posting the link to our survey donkey in the chat. So be sure to click on it before leaving this webinar. Also, you will find the recording of the whole webinar on our portal, http disabilityinclusion.msf.org, and you will find all our videos, e-learnings, and you will find the e-learning. So really enjoy it. Thanks to all the ones who are going to leave at 3:30 for attending the webinar, but for all the ones who can stay, so then I propose that we continue to have a bit of discussion and to answer to a lot of very, very good questions that there was in the chat. So for the one who want to leave, really click on the link for the survey, and thanks a lot for attending. And for the ones who can stay a little bit longer, 10-15 minutes, so then we are going to also answer some of the questions, and because it was really a lot of very good stuff. So I hope it's fine like that. Sorry for being a bit late on schedule, but it was so many interesting contributions. We could have done 10 hours just with what with the beautiful panels that we have. I saw, to start to answer some questions, I saw that I can take a few of them. In fact, there is one that is asking what's the future of the project. So to clarify that, we are, the TIC project as such is ending at the end of this year, as our steering group accepted that we are in a period where we had to kick off inclusion in the movement, and there is still a lot of work to do. And for that, what we decided was to introduce a proposal to our management team in Norway and to our board to say, well, it's a project that we think is important to continue. So the proposal is on the table, and don't hesitate to send your mails of support to me, to our general director, to our board, to say you love the project, you want it to continue. For us, so we made a proposal to have something that continues after this TIC, because we believe that something still to be done for a full inclusion. So we are at the moment of this proposal is introduced, and we wait as usually a bit towards November for the support from the board of this project or not. So that is the status so far. We have also a lot of questions about, I think there was a question that was very interesting, that if you are not a decision maker in the field, how can you make things move? I think that was a very, very interesting one, because it's like many other decisions in the field. It's about discussing it and raising awareness. So that's why we have a lot of raising awareness tools. So you can really propose to the management to say, well, let's discuss it. I have a video, it's a nice video, let's show it. We have a motion about it also, that is a very powerful tool. So don't hesitate to use the tools that we have, to use the fact that we have a motion to push on it, to use the speech of Mark Bio also, that is quite a very powerful one. And if you need our support also, if you want to ask us questions on how to do it, send us a mail. But you see already that you have tools, and it's like many other operational decisions in the field. It's about discussing it and bringing your awareness. So that's two questions on which I could already answer. I saw a question from Anna Nogva. Is there any standard routine for including action on inclusion of persons with disabilities in project? So I don't know if there is anyone in the panel who wants to pick up some question that I mentioned, just raise your hands. But to my knowledge, precisely, it is not integrated yet, as Mark mentioned, at least for the OCB, in our procedures. But it's precisely what has to happen. What is in front of us is that the operations own more and more inclusion and develop that in the guidelines. For instance, a big step forward has been with the platform of health promotion to include, in fact, already some practice, some good practice within the health promotion intersectional guideline when it comes to the COVID-19, to the response to the COVID-19. So already some steps have been done, and all that has to continue, in fact, with other policies, with other guidelines, as Mark mentioned. So I don't hesitate, Sonia, Jessie, Alice, if you want to add things. I'm picking up a bit some of the questions.
Just maybe to say that for procedures, how to be more inclusive, it starts also on the assessment level, I think. Think about your mapping in your community could already help a lot to see who are the groups in your communities, in your projects. Think about the different lenses that we talked about. And that is, there are social mapping tools, community mapping tools, social network analysis, and so on and so on. That can help in that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Someone maybe has a microphone. Maybe Louise, if you can mute. Yes, thank you.
Patrice, there was a question around kind of broader inclusion, including racial diversity and other forms of diversity and inclusion, like whether you do everything at once or one by one. And I just wanted to address that. I can't speak specifically for MSF, but I think that that's a question that comes up a lot. And I think that there's a tension. And my answer generally, and the way that I approach that, even within the organization I'm currently with, where it's a very much a like kind of a source of tension, and that's kind of that it's both all at once and one by one, but not enough. And what I mean by that is I think that the why we need to be inclusive is the same for all the different subpopulations, that we need to be inclusive because of our own values, because of humanitarian principles of impartiality, and also because diversity can strengthen our own workforce, but also our connection within communities. But then the how is necessarily different. And I think we see that even within disability. The disability we speak in one go, but the how you make sure that a service or even a clinical encounter is inclusive and accessible to somebody with autism is completely different than what it takes from somebody who has a physical impairment. And yet that shouldn't stop us from trying, that we do what we can, we take off chunks that we can deal with, ideally based on the needs that are most present at the moment, or just based on what resources we have at a particular time. But we realize that whatever we do, there's more to be done later, but that shouldn't stop us from starting. And I think that that's the same kind of attitude that I take for the question of inclusion overall, and that there's certain things that are easier to be done together in terms of data. And Habiba at the beginning said that we need data, that disaggregated data is useful for seeing how our inclusion projects are evolving. So if we're already adjusting a questionnaire, for example, like an intake questionnaire, then we should look at all those factors of inclusion all at once, because it's easier to adjust the questionnaire once rather than 5 times for 5 different populations. But then there's other elements that may, you do one and then you wait to do another. So, thanks.
Thank you, Miroslava. I continue a bit. I saw there are a bit some general questions that are interesting, where I can also a bit answer quickly. For instance, we have a question, I think, about, I am sure we are happy with the webinar, as it's 86 people, 88 people even online, but on a total of 64,000 people. So how to engage the 63,914 remaining colleagues, and how can we help? So really, that's what we said. Really, don't hesitate to raise awareness in your own settings, and to promote, so to show the video, to tell people do the e-learning online. And that's why we have everything is really online, and can be used by anyone and provoke discussion. And we see that very small things can make a difference. I don't know if some people in the panel have also some reactions on that. Don't hesitate to raise hands on how to communicate to the 63,000 other people. I can mention that the association has been extraordinarily supportive and an excellent channel. And I see that Habiba unmuted. So Habiba, I leave you the floor.
Okay, not to sound controversial, but I want to connect the question from Rina and the question from Philip, and give my own opinion. And this is my own personal opinion. So Rina, I totally agree with you. The aspect of decision making, the aspect of, I want to call it fake optimism. We keep saying we're closing the project tomorrow. Next year, we're having a project for next 20 years or 10 years, for example. And we ran projects of 10 years in an emergency mode when they've been there for the last 15 years, for example. So I totally agree with you. And I think one of the major challenges that we have with the aspect of not allowing this decision to make is the concept of not localizing decision making. And I think in the last couple of years, we've realized how bureaucratic we've become, how the governance structures become complicated, operations are being managed centrally in one place. And then you think one way and the other person goes the other way. Because when I gave my example is 2014, I put in the budget not a lot of money actually. And the idea was having three people from the patient support department, one clinician, one midwife to be trained in sign language. It was something we could do out of our pockets. And the reaction I got was crazy. It felt like I was out of place. I don't blame them at that point in time. And this went all the way to the HQ and I was like, you're out of your mind. If you talk about computer, if you want to train people on Excel, I don't know what, but sign language, we are not doing it. When you tell people that we need to have walking sticks when we are going to do an assessment, for example, and I like the aspect when somebody said, we have these 10 questions that you do when you're doing a rapid assessment in emergency context. One could be, do we have any local NGO working with people with disabilities, for example? Do we have data available, for instance? And what could be the things that we need? So I think localizing decision making has made it a very big problem because small things you have to go all the way to ask, things that you can do out of your pocket. This also to answer the question of what Philip says, and I totally agree with Philip. We're 86 people on a very important aspect called inclusion, people with disability. It shows that information is one thing, an expensive commodity that is never shared. Okay, we struggle to get information. And associatively speaking, as much as it sounds very easy, it's also something that everybody else struggles to get. So we might be passionate about one thing and everybody else is wondering. When we talk about human resource, and that's why I kept talking about the induction, the orientation, the briefing session. When you're coming in for a SANU, for example, SANU is a welcome training, welcome to a safe sort of training. The PPD, when you're preparing somebody to go to for a mission, for example, how do we indoctrinate in them and tell them that people with disability they are patients like any other person? So information is one thing we lack. I'm sure there are people out there who have no clue there's a TIC project on people with disability. And we are a huge organization. Our governance structure, our associative structure, executive structure, they're all complex. And it's true, we all need to be ambassadors, but so long as we don't localize decision making, then we're going to be very far from implementing stuff. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Abiba. Alors, it's extraordinary because I see that we have Louise online. We have Louise with us, and Louise can really tell us what she has been able to do, in fact, in DRC, very practically, and how much initiatives are possible. And Louise is a very great supportive to the project and has been really doing an amazing job in DRC. So, Louise, do you want to tell us a bit more about your experience? So just in a couple of minutes. Alors, if you can unmute, I see that you are still muted.
Allô?
Now you are good.
Ok. Bon après-midi à tous. Je vais expliquer un peu ce que ça s'est fait en RDC. Dommage, je ne parle pas l'anglais. Je parle français. Et...
Louise is going to explain us what she did in DRC. I will translate every sentence.
Patricia, if you want, I can if you want, and then it can be like they can read and you can talk.
Miroslava, you want to do the translation?
Je vais taper. Comme ça,
type it.
We don't have to do it twice. Just vous pouvez parler.
Okay, excellent. Miroslava, you are impressive. Thanks a lot for that.
Allez-y.
Ok. En RDC, on a commencé l'inclusion sur la sensibilisation, c'était l'année 2018. Avec Patrice, on était en contact pour l'inclusion, sur la sensibilisation dans des pays. Ces projets qui étaient magnifiques pour l'inclusion des personnes en situation de handicap. Le premier action que l'associatif a fait, c'était en décembre l'année passée, sur l'appui aux personnes vulnérables. Et ça s'est très bien passé. Ils étaient impliqués dans nos actions MSF et aussi ils étaient considérés. Pour eux, c'était une considération et aussi l'appui sur beaucoup de choses, de donations, de mobilisation, et c'était super passé. Maintenant, pendant la COVID-19, les personnes handicapées ou les orphelins ou les autres vulnérables, les personnes âgées, c'était une catégorie de personnes oubliées dans la communauté. La sensibilisation était difficile pour les atteindre et puis si la sensibilisation au niveau du pays n'était pas au top, pour les autres personnes, et qu'en est-il pour toutes ces personnes vulnérables? C'était difficile de comprendre, c'était difficile d'être informé sur la COVID-19 et c'était difficile d'avoir des informations nettes sur des mesures barrières et tout le reste qui est lié au COVID-19. L'associatif, en mois de juillet, a fait une descente sur le terrain, un truc de focus group pour s'imprégner de la réalité du terrain. Est-ce que la population comprenne ce que c'est Covid? Est-ce qu'il y a l'acceptance de ces messages au niveau de la communauté? Et on a fait cette étude, on a vu qu'il n'y avait pas vraiment une sensibilisation au niveau de la communauté. Et ce qui était grave encore, les personnes vivant avec handicap, les personnes âgées et les orphelins n'étaient pas sensibilisés. Et c'est à ce moment que l'associatif a orienté ses focus vers cette catégorie de personnes. Et maintenant, on est dans la phase où on a dit, on fait un petit projet. Et ce petit projet va essayer de se focaliser juste pour des personnes vulnérables. Et dans ces personnes vulnérables, il y avait 4 étapes. On a commencé par la sensibilisation, on a commencé par la formation, on entame la sensibilisation, on va faire quelques réhabilitations des bâtiments en état de délabrement grave, des latrines, des douches qui sont vraiment dans une condition pas possible. Et en plus, on va faire des donations. Ce qui a été fait, les activités réalisées jusque-là, on a sensibilisé, on a commencé par la formation des pères éducateurs de toutes ces personnes vulnérables. On a formé 18 pères éducateurs, des personnes vivant avec handicap, les représentants des orphelins et les représentants des personnes âgées. Et à cette catégorie de 18 personnes, ils sont en première ligne pour aller sensibiliser leur catégorie. Donc, c'est-à-dire, si vous avez des personnes non malvoyantes ou non-voyantes, les pères éducateurs sont des malvoyants et sont des non-voyants. Et d'autres qui les accompagnent, leurs aides. Si vous avez des personnes sourds-muets ou malentendants, c'est leur catégorie. Donc, on a fait une formation en fonction des catégories d'handicap et en fonction des vulnérabilités. Et ces personnes, 18 pères éducateurs, sont maintenant déployés sur le terrain où il y a les centres d'hébergement de personnes vivant avec handicap, où il y a les orphelins, les orphelinats, où il y a aussi les homes de vieillards. Et ces personnes sont en train de faire une mobilisation, une sensibilisation auprès des personnes vulnérables. La deuxième étape, c'est la sensibilisation faite par ces pères éducateurs. MSF est en deuxième plan pour accompagner ces pères éducateurs. Nous ne sommes pas en premier plan. On les a impliqués dans nos actions et on les a donné cette possibilité d'agir eux-mêmes auprès de leurs frères et sœurs qui sont dans la même catégorie qu'eux. Je pense que c'est vraiment une bonne...
Thanks a lot, Louise. I think it's a really a great initiative, a great associative initiative. So that's really impressive. And I know that WACA has been inspired also by you because they are really developing a similar project. So it's impressive to see that also you are contagious in the movement. So that's beautiful. Thanks a lot for telling us more about it. If you need more information, you can send us a mail or send a mail directly to Louise if you want to know how she did it and if you want to do something similar in your project. So thanks a lot, Louise, for that. I see also that we have a small, we have an HR question, so it's also interesting. What actively can you give to HR and hiring managers in order to actively recruit persons with disabilities? I think it's a lot about, as we say in the video already, just in a job offer to write that people with disabilities are welcome to apply, and of course as a group that you want to reach diversity, equity and inclusion, and that we value diversity in our organization is really a very good signal. So really already that is a very big step, and you can use also different channels. For instance, in missions, use organization representative of persons with disabilities as channels to make your job offer circulate as example. I don't know if we have more question or specifically so everything, it's a lot of questions about resistance, but really resistance, it's you have a motion is something powerful in the movement. There is a project and we can support you, and really you have a lot of tools to raise awareness. So don't hesitate to use that. Is there, so I give the floor to Anna, maybe 1 second to ask her if there are more questions that I missed for me or for the panelists.
You were asking amazing questions throughout this webinar. I was really impressed with the quality of questions and understanding and the engagement from all of you. We tried to touch upon the most important topics that you raised. I'm sure that we haven't managed to cover everything, but we will need to wrap up this webinar, but you have given us a lot of food of thought. And I'm sure that in the weeks to come, we'll also try to address some of these questions and get back to you with some new ideas and some new solutions. So that's the word from me. And also remember that you are always invited to reach out to us. We look for stories, we look for examples, we look for inspiration, we look for ideas that we can share. And we do also have tools such as the newsletter and the portal where there's always space for this kind of sharing. And we know as well that there's a lot of going on already in the movement. Sometimes this news doesn't reach us. So if you have good news to share, a success story, an example, also don't hesitate to reach to us. That's all from my side.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Anna. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks to all our participants for staying a bit longer. Sorry for that. I think we should have planned 2 hours. We have so much to say, but it's beautiful to see that we have a lot to say about this and that there is so much interest. We'll do it again for sure. And it was a pleasure to have this beautiful panel. And it was a pleasure to see all your supports. And we reached 88 participants at the top of the meeting. So, and thanks a lot for the one who could stay even a bit longer. Because it was really very nice from us to read your support and to read your questions. If you have more questions, you can send me by email. Don't hesitate to send us also questions for follow-up. And really, we invite you to enjoy the e-learning. And don't forget, before leaving, so to click on the link and to do this evaluation, this survey about the webinar. Thanks a lot to all of you. Big applaud to all our participants and big applaud to our beautiful panel. And thanks a lot, Louise, also for intervening a bit unplanned. So that was very nice of you.
Merci.